The Welsh women's football team have been plagued by a spate of ACL injuries. I'm Ollie Mann. This is The Week Unwrapped. Harriet, tell us more.
Well, the story is that this week the Women's Euros tournament is kicking off. So we've got England's opening game against Wales on Sunday, and that's the sound of the Wales team arriving in their hotel in
Underwhelming
Switzerland.
sound of the Wales team arriving. Oh, look, there's a water fountain.
But it's a very nice water fountain.
Yes, sure.
But the story is that the Wales squad has been hammered by all of these knee injuries to their anterior cruciate ligament, which is the ACL, which is very similar to what happened to the England squad before the World Cup in 2023, which became known as the curse of the Lionesses. So their goalkeeper is out, a defender's out, and midfielder Megan Wynne, who's sort of been tipped as kind of a rising star, have all been ruled out of the tournament. And Megan Wynne ruptured her ACL in the final game of the season in April. It's actually her second ACL injury. The first came in 2020. And Sophie Ingle, who's the former Wales captain and kind of a queen of women's football, has just announced that she's fit to return, and she hasn't played for more than a year after her ACL surgery. So I thought we could use this as a way to talk about the prevalence of ACL injuries among female footballers and why that's massively on the rise.
Okay. Jamie, just how prevalent are these ACL injuries amongst female footballers?
Yeah, pretty prevalent. Studies suggest women are up to 6 times more likely to suffer ACL injuries than men in similar sports. Quite dozens of the elite female players have, including Beth Mead, Vivian Miedema, Sam Kerr and Leah Williamson, have all suffered ACL injuries in the past 2 seasons. I imagine you're going to ask why, Ollie.
I am.
That's the next question. And I mean, the causes are fairly complex. The truth is that there's not been enough research done, unsurprisingly, on women's bodies and women's health to know exactly why it is. I mean, some of the issue is ascribed to training regimes. Some of it is down to the equipment, obviously. A bit, actually, like we were talking about the army. All of the football equipment kit that they use was obviously designed for men and not necessarily designed for women. There was actually a really interesting study looking into whether period cycles and levels of estrogen in women could affect joint stability and whether or not that was the case. But these are all things that are only being looked at now after like this a huge amount of issues with it. Literally, we're talking about in the last year that these studies are taking place.
But hold on, Felicity. Women's football is this massive growth sport, right? So when Jamie says all of the kit they're using was designed for men, that doesn't feel instinctively true to me. It feels like, surely, you know, if you're Reebok or Adidas or something, in the last 10 years, you've been pouring money into developing things specifically for women. It's this huge area they want to boost.
I was also really surprised by that. A lot of the chat seems to be about female footballers' shoes, that they're just basically like men's shoes but smaller, whereas runners, they have, you know, female runners have shoes that are for their feet, and I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that the big sports giants hadn't done more, especially with, as you were saying, with the rise of the sport. But I think the rise of the sport is part of the problem in a way, because there's more pressure and more demand on these sportswomen. So they're having to train harder, they're having to do more matches, and this creates more of a pressure on their bodies. It's also to do with the surfaces that they play on, and a lot of the times they haven't had enough strength training in to begin with, as they sort of come up the ranks to strengthen their ACL in the first place. But it's worth saying, I mean, I think there's like so many reasons why this is going to be a problem, and obviously it's worth pointing out the obvious one, that the female body is very different to the male body. So things like the pelvis is wider, there's less muscle mass around women's knees, women have less testosterone, which is a key hormone for increasing muscle density, and they also have more estrogen than men, which is essential to bone growth. And that's why periods are also a big deal, because estrogen fluctuates during a woman's menstrual cycle, so that can also affect. But it's all these things that we're sort of only just catching up with now, and it's not just sport, obviously, and also it's not just women's football. There's other sports like basketball, I think volleyball, anyone where you have to like zigzag and pivot is really, really bad for your knees. But it's a kind of classic case of we still don't really fully understand women's bodies, basically.
But it's interesting though, because there are all of these biological components, obviously, There was a 2021 study in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, though, that showed that prevention tactics based on biological differences between men and women didn't actually decrease the disparity of injuries between the two sexes. So most people are now concluding that the bigger contributing factor to the rising massive prevalence of ACL injuries among female sports players are environmental issues. So gendered environmental issues. So particularly the fact that there aren't really structured pathways from kind of amateur young children and adolescents up to the adult elite, as in the same way that there are training pathways from the very young among male athletes and footballers in particular.
So that seems like missing out on physio.
Yeah, so less monitoring overall throughout the years, fewer qualified coaches, less investment in physio, fewer staff. There are just fewer staff with women's teams as well. They just don't have the resources for medical monitoring.
On that though, because one of the sort of major national women's teams that have had an issue around this and have been part of a study is Arsenal, right? Arsenal women.
Yes.
I know because they actually, as it happens, have their practice training ground around the corner from me, that they are very well resourced for a women's team and very well
for a women's team.
Yeah, but then like, is how much money is enough money if
Arsenal
can't do it?
But you've just said yourself, they're very well resourced for a women's team. Compare the resources allocated for the men's team, it's a drop in the ocean. They're also generally, the female teams are not permitted to play at the men's stadiums, regardless of how well resourced they are. Chelsea women, for example, one of the best teams there are, they do not play at Stamford Bridge, generally speaking. So the men's pitches are better quality. Women are much more likely to be playing on frozen or boggy ground. So there's all sorts of issues in which, no matter how well resourced and well funded that women's teams are comparatively, there's still absolutely not even close to being comparable to the men's resources and men's teams.
But I suppose, in a positive take on this, Jamie, that might get sort of ironed out as the growth in women's sport comes up from grassroots. I was at my son's sports day this week at primary school, and one of the observations lots of people were kind of quietly making in the crowd was the girls seem to be better at the football task than the boys these days. When you're looking at 5 and 6 year olds, they're a bit taller and they're a bit more analytical, and the boys just didn't have the patience to get the ball in the back of the net. So you kind of think, well, if that barrier's been smashed down in terms of access, then by the time those girls are 17, naturally we won't be having this conversation anymore.
Well, they said the same thing when I was 7.
And are you a professional footballer, Harriet?
Could have been. Could have. Shoulda, woulda, coulda.
Okay. I think it's, I mean, I'm speaking as a father of a girl. I have been spending quite a lot of time trying to throw a ball at her. I mean, she's only 8 months old, so it's difficult for her to really respond in the way that I would think.
That's
abuse.
Hope. But
yeah, no, I mean, it's a soft ball, right. And to be honest, you know, she's more interested in other things. But I'm still training. We've got a bespoke training schedule, and I do. What's interesting is before I had a child, I spoke to a lot of my female friends about the one thing that they would say about tips about being a girl, because obviously I'm not a girl, so how would I ever know what it's like to be a girl? And they all said that they wish that they'd continue doing sports over the age of 10 or 11, and that was the thing to push onto my child. And I think that's really telling, is that actually, yes, I agree that hopefully this will be beneficial in the long run, but it's a long thing, right? What you want to do is give teenage girls the opportunity and the space to develop sports skills or continue on with sports. And if there's a fear that they might get an ACL injury, that's going to put some people off. And I think the more that we can do sooner to change those parameters, potentially, the better.
Well, who's we, though, Felicity, in this instance? You know, the more we can do. Where's the money going to come from? Who's investing in this? What should be done?
It's a good question, but I mean the clubs themselves and the money just needs to be used better. There needs to be more medical trials and more research done. Otherwise, it made me slightly think of the CTE scandal in American football and then rugby, which was don't ask me what it stands for, chronic traumatic something, but it was basically that they realised that repeated blows to the head would give you this awful brain disease, and there's been all sorts of cases in this country, in the US, over it. And there was a very good film, was it Will Smith, called Concussion, which part of the problem was that financial motives were stopping people from investigating this cause. And so I sort of feel like it's not completely the same thing as ACL injuries, but if there isn't a proper duty of care, and if sports bodies don't take this seriously, that is, and there is, a sort of known link between the kit that these women have, or the ways they haven't been properly trained for it, then I think you could see a similar sort of thing emerging. I mean, it seems like a bit of an epidemic that's coming out of the shadows, but I do think they need to get on top of it pretty quickly. But going back to my earlier point, women's bodies are different, unfortunately.
Although in women's football, I think it's worth saying that one of the issues is that the vast majority of injuries, so I think nearly 90% of injuries in women's football are non-contact injuries. So in terms of the duty of care, it's actually very difficult to approach it in that way. In terms of the governing bodies, though, so actually in April this year, FIFA announced that it would be funding a year-long study, which started in June in a university in London, into whether hormonal fluctuations around your menstrual cycle could be contributing to the rise in ACL injuries. Because we know from previous research that female sports players are 6 times more likely to be injured in the days leading up to their period, which, as a person that goes to the gym 3 or 4 times a week, I can say absolutely for sure, the days leading up to a period, your body functions completely differently. Your strength completely goes, your balance completely goes. It's an extraordinary change. And separately, the Professional Footballers Association with Nike and FIFA Pro have launched a separate 3-year study into ACL injury prevention to focus on all the environmental factors that we discussed, like the facilities, the equipment, the staff. And there's been quite a good success, actually, with ACL injury prevention programs in hockey, in women's field hockey in Australia. Was very successful. There were 0 ACL injuries after this study that was implemented in 2019, which was really interesting. But just to go back to what Jamie was saying about thinking about when I stopped doing sport as a teenager and why. So I went to an all-girls school, and it was extraordinary how fast when we started getting our periods, and particularly when breasts start growing, and it's incredibly painful. I mean, it really is. Like, Felicity, you would agree with me here that is a very incredibly painful process, particularly when you're doing sport. And you're doing sport and your body's changing constantly, and you don't have the resources to invest in sports bras. Sports bras aren't part of your traditional sports kit, for example. So that's the big problem, is that you'd have to get a new sports bra every 3 to 6 to 8 months. They're very expensive. It's £40 minimum for a kind of standard one. So there's all these factors that when the female body starts changing, you're dealing with pain and weakness around periods and the pain of growing breasts, and also the societal expectation that comes in as a teenager where you should look a certain way. And that's a really big thing that's cited in all of these studies, is that when women are teenagers, it's not considered to be desirable to look very strong, to look physically fit, to work out, to even though resistance training is on the rise among women, it's still not necessarily what teenage girls want to look like. It's very strong and muscly. There's a lot of negative associations around that. You'd have a lot of accusations from guys at that age of being like unfeminine or unsexy. So there's just such a massive barrier as a teenage girl to continuing with sport. And I think there's so much that still needs to be done on that front.
That's really interesting because, I mean, subsidising sports bras, that feels like a quite straightforward thing, actually, if it is just a question
and yet it's never happened. You talk about, you're saying things like, oh, well, hopefully now that women's sport is starting to this, and then hopefully this. Actually, we said all that at the last World Cup. We said all that at the World Cup before that. I've been hearing that same argument about women's sports for 10 years in journalism, and still here we are.
Well, actually, just lastly on that, because, this is a big story, the Euros, not necessarily these injuries to the players. Is it real? Because that's the thing, because I'm not a football fan, so I can't tell whether this supposed excitement that the women's game is matching the men's game is really there in the general public or not. Will you be watching this tournament like you would the men's one?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, because I specifically remember with the World Cup in 2023, I was so keen to watch all of the matches in pubs. You would not believe how few pubs actually said that they were showing the games, actually had any way of booking it. In terms of the excitement and the investment and the kind of hyping that goes on with the men's World Cup and the men's Euros, it just isn't there. It just isn't the same. But I do think it depends how far England goes, because obviously there was huge excitement when England won the Euros. They're obviously the reigning champions, and they got very, very close with the World Cup. Now, obviously, Spain are reigning champions there. So, like every sport in the UK and in England in particular, I think it totally depends how far England actually goes.
And also, actually worth saying, Jamie, you're in Scotland. Is there any excitement to watch England or Wales, indeed, up there?
No, not at all. I think that if you would even mention that England were playing, could you put it on the TV, you'd be laughed out of any establishment here.
That's quite a good outcome compared to how you can be treated in some pubs I've been to in Glasgow.